Hi, this is Robert Clotworthy, and you are listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Here are your hosts, James McQuiston, Oak Island theorist and author, along with John Hamels, PhD and historical researcher. Get the whole story right here, brought to you by Rabbit Hole Investigations.
Well, thank you, Robert, for that introduction, and we want to welcome you folks back to the third episode of Oak Island Plus. And we're so excited to report that our first episode had over 1,400 viewers, and then our second episode had over 2,600 viewers. So we're hoping that momentum continues. And it will continue if you tell your neighbors to share and get online and take a look. So you may have noticed that my partner in crime here, Doc Hamels, didn't show up today. But instead, we have quite the illustrious guest, Sir William Alexander from the 17th century. So this is a once-in-a-lifetime chance to talk to this gentleman, and I have myself a long list of notes here to refer to. And every word that Sir William says today is going to be something that he actually wrote, or that was written to him, or written about him. This is all contemporary to the early 17th century. This collection of quotes will show the viewer just how important his life and his adventures in Nova Scotia were, especially surrounding Oak Island, which is our theme. So, Sir William was born on Knights Templar land at a castle called Menstrie Castle, and he was born in 1567. And just a few years before that, Mary Queen of Scots had regranted his family that land, that Templar land. And then, a few years later, she regranted the right of Masons to meet in secret, along with their deacon. And finally, in 1563, she accepted the final possessions and properties of the Knights Templar and the Knights of Malta in Scotland. Well, all of this tremendously historic activity was taking place just 40 miles from where Sir William was growing up. So there's no way that he could not know that all of this was happening. So when William was only 20 years old, Mary Queen of Scots was executed by her own cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England. And so this had to make quite the impression on him. His family was associated with a lot of other families that were associated with Mary Queen of Scots. And so he managed to work his way into the court of her son, James VI of Scotland, as the tutor of his children. And he slowly and methodically worked his way up through government to where he became eventually the Secretary of State of Scotland. And he held several titles, and one of those titles was he was given the proprietorship of Nova Scotia. And how that came about was that New England had been founded, and the French were up in Canada, which they called New France. And there was this somewhat a no man's land in between the two. And so he was given that land to create a buffer between France and New England. But as he got started in life, he actually started out on the path of being a poet and a playwright. And in fact, in 1603, the same year he moved to London with King James, who then became King James I of England, he also wrote his first poem, Darius.
I present thy favorable view and censure the first essay of my rude and unskillful muse, in a tragical poem dedicated to the most excellent, high, and mighty Prince James the King of Scots, my dread sovereign.
Well, William's modest opinion of himself was not shared by other poets and playwrights of the era, and in fact he became pretty famous. But he also saw all the intrigue that was taking place in the Scottish court and then later in the English court, and he decided on a different path in life, which was to pursue a kingdom, if you will, in the New World, which ultimately ended up being Nova Scotia. Now, earlier in his life, he had traveled to Italy and France with another clan chieftain that he was tutoring, and he learned French and he learned Italian. And the French came in really handy as he negotiated with the French over Nova Scotia, and the Italian came in really handy as he negotiated with representatives from the Pope to get a special dispensation for Prince Charles, the son of King James, and Princess Henrietta Marie, the sister of the French king. And this intercession, in retrospect, can be seen as one of many steps that he took to recreate what was called the Auld Alliance. Now, the Auld Alliance was a partnership, if you will, between Scotland and France because they had a mutual enemy, England. And under Mary Queen of Scots, it was dissolved through pressure from Parliament. And he had seen the worth of it and wanted to reestablish it. So William Alexander had already seen what his friends Sir Francis Bacon and Sir Thomas Howard had done in the New World with the Plymouth colony, with Newfoundland, and with the Virginia colony, and he wanted a piece of the action. And he was offered the area that the French called Acadia in 1621, and King James went along with the plan. One of the inspirations for William Alexander may have been this Frenchman named Villeneuve, and he was actually a Scottish hero. He had taken Mary Queen of Scots to France when she was only 5 years old to protect her from the English. And he had gone to South America, and he tried to establish a colony down there. And this is what William Alexander had to say about Villeneuve.
He had a desire to retire himself from the vanity, corruption, and vexation of his parts to some remote place in America, where he might, free from all kind of impediments, begin a new life, and where he hoped to found such a colony as should serve for a retreat to where all those weary of the persecutions at home could go, where they might live with safety and enjoy the liberty of their conscience.
And I believe that this is what William Alexander wanted to do for himself and his fellow clansmen, was to create a utopia, as it were, in Nova Scotia, where they could be free of the plagues and the courtly intrigue, all the things that were going wrong in Europe at the time. And in fact, he even wrote in utopian terms in his book about Nova Scotia. So it's interesting to note about Villeneuve. When he did go to Brazil, there's very good records of them landing there. And the first thing they did was get out of their boats and go up and build stone walls for protection. Well, in last month's show, we showed how the Knights of Malta, Villeneuve was a Knight of Malta, we showed how they apparently built stone walls at a place called Port Malta. Now it's called Port Medway in Nova Scotia. It's not very far from Oak Island. So that was a common practice. Get off the boat, build yourself a stone defensive wall. So William Alexander had his sights set on this land in between New England and New France. And he called that land New Scotland. And in Latin, New Scotland is Nova Scotia. And that happened in 1621.
We have the more willingly hearkened to a motion made unto us by our trusty and well-beloved counselor, Sir William Alexander, Knight, who hath a purpose to procure a foreign settlement, having made choice of lands lying between our colonies of New England and Newfoundland, both the governors whereof have encouraged him thereunto. Therefore, that he and such as will undertake with him by getting of good security may be the better enabled hereunto, our pleasure is that after due consideration, if you find this course as we have conceived it to be for the good of that our kingdom, that you grant unto the said Sir William his heirs and assigns, or to any other that will join him in the whole or in any part thereof, a signatory under our great seal of the said lands lying between New England and Newfoundland, as he shall design them particularly unto you to be holden of us from the kingdom of Scotland.
And those were the words of King James in August of 1621, and by September of 1621, William Alexander owned Nova Scotia. And he wrote about his first idea of why he would even want to go there.
Being such encouraged hereunto by Fernando George and some others of the undertakers for New England, I showed them that my countrymen would never adventure in such an enterprise unless it were as there was a New France, a New Spain, and a New England, that they might likewise have a New Scotland.
And thus, Nova Scotia became Nova Scotia. And history doesn't record this specifically, but I believe there's enough evidence to prove that William Alexander actually traveled to Nova Scotia. Some of his other friends who had land in the New World traveled there, and travel back and forth was not that rare. Once the Plymouth colony and the Virginia colony were established, there were 50 or so ships a year going over. And one of the main reasons why I believe this is because of something that William Alexander said in 1624.
I have never remembered anything with more admiration than America.
And in fact, there's a museum in Liverpool, Nova Scotia, that has William Alexander's name on a wall. We have a photo of it sent by Art Guinness, our guest from last month. And it says specifically that he came over and surveyed Nova Scotia. Well, also of interest, King Charles. Once Charles became king, he stated,
A place in America commonly called by the name of Nova Scotia, already discovered and surveyed by the pains and travel of our well-beloved counselor, Sir William Alexander of Menstrie.
So I think the words of William Alexander, the words of King Charles I, whatever source the Liverpool Museum used for their wall, and just a lot of other miscellaneous history surrounding the story, seem to prove that William Alexander actually traveled to Nova Scotia to see this new province that he had inherited. And why wouldn't he? Because it was about 2/3 the size of Scotland, and it's just sitting there waiting for him to go see, full of lumber, beaver, fish, and potentially valuable metals, gold, silver, copper. The other clue that I found in all of this is that there's a place right up above Oak Island called New Ross. It's less than 20 miles up, and it follows the Gold River on the way up there. Well, the old name for New Ross was Charing Cross. And William Alexander lived at Charing Cross in London, England. So did Sir Francis Bacon for a while, and he actually died there. So did their friend Sir Thomas Howard. He had a home there. And not very far away, the only home that William Shakespeare ever purchased in London was located. So there's just awful lot of people that lived in that little neighborhood. It was called Covent Gardens. And William lived there from 1632 till he died in 1640. His father-in-law died there. His granddaughter died there, I believe, 1682, something like that. So it was a family home for many years, and it was within walking distance of all of these famous people. And these same people served on the Privy Council with him. So it was a group of what we'd like to call conspirators, in a good way.
Some of the heads of the chief clans of the Highlands to take themselves and their followers to settle themselves into New Scotland.
That was Alexander's idea. Go to the clan chiefs. Scotland had been deforested once it was basically taken over by England, a little bit demoralized. There were a lot of broken men on the highways. And he saw this as a chance not only to help his native Scotland, but also to help him populate this new province that he was given. Nova Scotia is almost an island. It only connects at New Brunswick, and it's sometimes called a peninsula. And he seemed to like that idea.
Though sundry other preceding patents are imaginarily limited by the degrees of heaven, I think that mine is the first national patent that ever was clearly bounded within America by particular limits upon the earth.
And he was so proud of it that he had a map drawn of it. And this map is from 1624. It has some very interesting names on it. But what's interesting about it is that nobody can seem to pinpoint who drew the map. And since William Alexander has been credited with surveying Nova Scotia, he must have had a map maker with him that drew this map. And it was actually used for quite a while as the most accurate Nova Scotia map. And you can see it on the screen right there. Although it's incorrectly written that William Alexander's settlement in Nova Scotia failed, that's just not true. The only reason it was shut down was because of a treaty between King Charles of England and King Louis of France over a money issue. And that's what caused the Scots to be asked to leave in March of 1632. It had nothing to do with any kind of failure on the part of William Alexander or his knights of Nova Scotia. And in fact, they fought their expulsion for a long time.
The said term of 8 days being given them to retire from said places, positions, and forts with their arms, baggage, goods, gold, silver, furniture, and generally all that may belong to them, to whom and to all those who are in said places is given a term of 3 weeks after the said 8 days are expired, during which, or sooner, if may be, to embark in their vessels with their arms, and generally all which belongs to them, to remove from thence into England without staying longer in those countries.
And that was the order to leave, issued on March 29th, 1632, and that's when I believe they went over to Oak Island and left some things behind that they did not want to take back with them. And the irony of this treaty between the Charles and between Louis was that William Alexander most obviously was trying to recreate this old alliance. And part of the proof of that is that he deeded a considerable part of the land to two French leaders, a father and a son, Claude and Charles de La Tour. That land that he deeded included where Oak Island is, because it's called Merlegash, and that word is thought to be a Mi'kmaq word, but in fact it's an old Gaelic word. And the deed itself, it's the oldest written record of that name, and the deed itself was written in French at Charing Cross in London, England, at his Covent Garden estate. So I looked up Merlegash at the request of Doug Crow from the Oak Island team, and I found out as far back as the 9th century, Mer meant a part of, and Lagash meant a league or an alliance. So it was a Gaelic word saying part of the alliance. Well, the alliance was the old alliance that Sir William Alexander was trying to rekindle with France and Scotland. After his settlers left, he left about 50 behind. And they were when they left, they were allowed to keep their silver and their gold and their weaponry. So it wasn't a vicious attack on the Scots and a forceful ejection. But about 50 of them stayed behind, and even when they were captured, not only were they peacefully taken back to England, but they were paid quite a bit of money for the supplies that they left behind that the French could use. And there would be no reason to do that unless they were all focused on trying to keep the peace. Now, 1632 has been my target date for the Oak Island mystery for quite a few years now, in virtually all of my books. And there was an owner of Oak Island in the 1930s. His name was Gilbert Hedden, and he had written once that he felt the Money Pit mystery started around 1630. In fact, he wrote that to a fan, but to Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, he wrote somewhere between 1635 and 1645. So he's right in the ballpark of my 1632 date, and he based that on data that had nothing to do with my research. He based it on carbon dating and on other facets. So it's kind of nice to have a past owner of Oak Island agree with you for the roughly the time period when all of this started. But as William Alexander was trying to get going with this new colony, he had a lot of trouble scarfing together any money. And he wrote to the Lord Treasurer a plea to please send the money that he was promised from the king.
I fear the Lord Treasurer's delay in his dispatch of funds will sacrifice substance to form and reveal the business at hand. May I suggest that the king's financier, Berlavachi, might furnish me privately and quietly with money by selling some iron weaponry, which he's allowed to transport. I fear that the business is too much to divulge, but hope it may be managed so as to avoid disgrace should it fail.
So obviously settling Nova Scotia meant more to Sir William than it did to just about anybody else. He also went to his friends to try to gather up some funds for his project, and he wrote a letter to one of them.
I can lift no money here in haste. The English merchants never taking Scottish securities, and the Scottish factors not having money.
So finally he approached King James about creating a new knighthood called the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia. And his idea was that each one of these knights would pay a fee, a pretty hefty fee, and they would supply 6 men who were artisans or craftsmen, so that when they got over to Nova Scotia, they could build towns. Originally, he was going to knight about 100 men, and they were going to build 100 towns all the way around the coast of Nova Scotia. he eventually expanded that to 150, and ultimately there were around 130 men who signed up as Knights of Nova Scotia. But he had to get James to sign on first, and then once James signed on, James had to get Parliament to reaffirm this plan. So he wrote to King James,
"You who are born to rule nations may be the beginner of nations, enlarging this monarchy without blood and making a conquest without the wrongdoing of others. The glory of greatness, consisting more in the raising than in the ruining of others. It is a far better course to purchase fame by the settlement of a new world, not as many princes have done by the desolation of this one."
So eventually, he convinced King James. King James presented it to Parliament, and it was approved. That original plan started in 1624, but the final papers weren't signed till the first part of 1625, and unfortunately, King James passed away within days of it, so he didn't even see it come to fruition. But his son, King Charles, was very encouraged by it and jumped right in the fray, and he knighted every single knight of Nova Scotia up till the year he was beheaded, which was 1649. So he played a major role in this. And what was interesting about the knighthood was that you were essentially above the law. The way it was written, you were above the law, and you answered only to William Alexander, not to the king or to anyone else.
The Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia will be governed only by the laws of said realm of Nova Scotia, expressed in the investment granted to Sir William Alexander and his heirs.
A lot of them jumped at the chance to do this to get a place over in the New World for their clans, since things were tightening up so bad in Scotland. But King James, hearing the cries of the other knighthoods, promised that he would never create another knighthood like this. These knights were placed in between all other knights and the Lords of Parliament. That was their position in the hierarchy. But he promised that he would never do that again. And there was a pretty unkind contemporary of William Alexander who wrote this about him.
"Like another King Arthur, William Alexander must have his knights, though nothing limited to so small a number, for how many soever that could have looked out but for one day like gentlemen. They had a toll bridge from him whereby to ascend unto platforms of virtue."
Luckily, King Charles had a much higher view of the Knights Baronet of Nova Scotia, and so he reaffirmed William Alexander's rights to the Knights and to Nova Scotia.
"Having perused this patent, I shall set down the honours and privileges granted to Knights Baronets in Scotland as follows. 1. In all writings they are styled Knights and Baronets. 2. In addressing them they are called Sir. 3. Their wives have the honour of Lady. 4. They have precedency over all knights, lairds, esquires, and gentlemen, except the king's commissioners and councillors. No other degree of honour shall ever be created betwixt them and the lords, nor any degree equal to them."
So that statement was from King Charles, written on November 17th, 1629, right at the very beginning of the settlement of Nova Scotia. So Alexander's first three Knights Baronet are very interesting people. They were initiated on May 28th, 1625. And if you just take a look at these three, they were all involved somehow in a major theft of a treasure in Scotland. One of the earliest Knights Baronet was a man named Alexander Strachan, and I call him Al Strachan, and he robbed a massive treasure from the Earl Marshal of Scotland. He also robbed the younger wife of the Earl Marshal, and he was put on trial, or at least indicted, and his trial kept getting delayed. And in the beginning of 1625, King James, before he passed away, gave Strachan a full pardon. So when May 28th came around, Strachan was one of the first to be initiated as a Knight Baronet. And he received 16,000 acres over in New Brunswick, which at the time was part of Nova Scotia. And his land was located right across from Port Royal, which was said to be the ultimate place where the Scots were going to settle. It was an old French settlement. So it was very strategically placed. Another knight was Keith, who was the son of the man who was robbed. He inherited the title, Earl Marshal, and the lands, several castles, but the whereabouts of the treasure has never been discovered. And I approached the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, of which I'm a member. I approached the Scottish National Museums and the Scottish National Records, and nobody knows what happened to all of this money, and it could be worth over $1 billion today. I did find two little records that might explain where a few items of the treasure went, but the bulk of the treasure was so gigantic that there should be a record somewhere of what happened to that, and there's a possibility that it was used to help finance Nova Scotia so that Al Strachan could get out of jail. The third knight that's worth talking about is Sir Robert Gordon. And at first I didn't see where he was involved at all in the robbery, but what I found out eventually was that his family had been in a feud with George Keith's family, the man that was robbed, for decades. It was like the Hatfields and McCoys of American legend. And so their lands were very close to each other. They vied for the same land. Whenever a piece of land would come up, they'd both be bidding on it. So all three of these gentlemen that were knighted on that day were all somehow involved or at odds with George Keith. Obviously, his son William Keith was, because he was sitting in the same room with the man who robbed him and became a knight right alongside him on the same day. So my theory is that the fix was in right from the beginning because this man had so much treasure. So at this point we have William Alexander, who owns Nova Scotia, and we have his first three knights. The Alexanders are up in New Ross above Oak Island. Robert Gordon's property is at Port Mattoon, which is just down the coast from Oak Island. Al Strachan's land is over strategically placed across from Port Royal, and I haven't found out where the Keith property was yet, but he had 48,000 acres, 3 times any other Knight Baronet, most likely because it was his inheritance that was stolen. So they were strategically placed throughout Nova Scotia to take it over. And that was just 3 of the many knights that joined. A few other knights were actually involved in the robbery too, but these were the 3 that were knighted on the very first day. And this just screams out, the fix is in, the fix is in. Gordon, Keith, and Strachan also signed a paper to finance a ship to go to Nova Scotia. And that document reads,
"In witness whereof being written by James Philip, servant to Sir William Alexander, Knight, Secretary to His Majesty for Scotland, we have subscribed their presence with our hands at Wanstead, the 11th day of July, the year of God 1626, before these witnesses, Sir William Alexander and James Philip.
So in a possible attempt to bring peace to Nova Scotia early on, Sir William Alexander catered to the Mi'kmaq band of First Nations that lived there. There's indication that his son had a handfast marriage with a princess. He brought over the king of the Mi'kmaq to England with his wife and his son. And he also seemed to want to make peace with the French. And so, as I spoke about earlier, he deeded that land of Merlegash to two of the strongest French leaders there at the time. And also in 1624, he wrote specifically about the Auld Alliance, although he called it the Ancient League. But he talked about his wish that the French in Nova Scotia would adhere to it, and that he hoped that the new King of France, King Louis, would rekindle that along with King Charles, basically because of the intermarriage of the royal families. And he wrote,
France, in regard of the Ancient League, did find the means to force out some small fortunes in Nova Scotia till of late. That the French, though not altogether violating our people, yet not valuing their friendship, which was so religiously observed by their predecessors, which the king now reigning, we hope will restore to its original integrity.
and the deed for Merlegash was written, like I said, in Charing Cross, or near Charing Cross, in London. It was written in French. That's the oldest record of the name Merlegash. And it was actually witnessed by 4 men, one of those men being Al Strachan, the thief of the treasure. It was also notarized by 3 notaries. It was notarized by one, and then that notary's signature was notarized by 2 other notaries. So he wanted to make sure that this was a legitimate deed that everybody would believe in. And part of that deed reads,
Know all those who these letters patent shall see or shall hear that upon this present 30th day of April, in the year of our Lord, 1630, Lord William Alexander, Knight, Chief Secretary of State for the Kingdom of Scotland, for his said Majesty of Great Britain, Privy Councillor of State, and Lieutenant unto his Majesty of New Scotland in America, beareth unto Sir Claude, Lord of La Tour, and unto Sir Charles his son, all the country, coast, and islands following the coast of said country, towards the east and unto Port La Tour, and further beyond said port, following the coast unto Mirlagash, near unto and beyond the port in Cape of La Have, drawing forward 15 leagues within the said lands to the north of all the said lands and seas, Knight de la Tour and his son shall receive all the fruits, profits, and emoluments that may be provided.
so that's the first time that the name Merlegash was ever mentioned. And today it's said to mean Lunenburg and to be a Mi'kmaq word, but it's obviously a Gaelic word that was written in London in this deed. And what's interesting is that it states specifically 15 leagues beyond La Have. Well, 15 leagues translates to about 52 and a half miles, and that extends far beyond Mahone Bay. So the original Mirligash would have included Mahone Bay, which means it would have included Oak Island, because it says specifically in the deed all of the islands. And right up above that was New Ross, and the Alexander family tradition says that they left New Ross in 1630, the same year this deed was written to the Latours. They returned in 1641. So all of this history, even though it isn't considered mainstream, points to the fact that New Ross was settled by the Alexanders. They lived there until William Alexander sold it to the Latours, apparently to bring peace between the Scots and the French. And there never was a big battle between the Scots and the French. There were plenty of them between the French and the English later, but there never was a big battle between the Scots and the French. And what's interesting about Mirligash is that the very last knight baronet ever of Nova Scotia that received land was a man named Sir Thomas Temple. And he specifically, when he's mentioning his land, the first piece of land he mentions is Mirligash. Well, he was a forefather of Franklin Roosevelt, who, as we know, had a great interest in Oak Island. He wasn't a direct ancestor, but they both descended from the same man. And when Thomas Temple passed away, he left all of his property to his nephew, who was a direct ancestor of Franklin Roosevelt. The paperwork about Temple buying Mirligash from the Latours is in Harvard University. You can read it today. And Harvard University is where Franklin Roosevelt went to a university. So again, we have a full circle situation here. Mirligash in the hands of William Alexander, transfers to the Latours, transfers to Thomas Temple, transfers to John Nelson, an ancestor of Franklin Roosevelt. One of the most famous photos of Nova Scotia, of Oak Island, is actually Franklin Roosevelt standing with a work crew. It's kind of funny because he's wearing white shoes, so you wonder how hard he was working. But they think that he was there at least 2 seasons, possibly 3 seasons. So I want to thank you for joining us today in this 3rd episode of Oak Island Plus. We've tried to present some serious history that falls outside the mainstream sometimes, but is well documented. I've worked with other investigators over the Mirligash area. I have maps of Mahone Bay being called Mirligash. I actually have maps of the little town of Chester being called Mirligash. So the story is much bigger. This is what we said in last month's episode. The story is much bigger than what is generally told. So I think it's time for a final word from our great guest from the 17th century, Sir William Alexander. Take it away.
Nations once sought to command their neighbors, and there was for many ages no speech except of wrongs and revenges, conquests and revolts, and ruining of countries, a continual revolution determining the period of the times by the miseries of mankind. I have never remembered anything with more admiration than America, considering how it has pleased the Lord to lock it up for so long amidst the depths of the sea, concealing it from the curiosity of the ancients, that it might be discovered in a time fit for their descendants. I cannot but be confident that my own countrymen are as fit for such a purpose as any men in the world, having daring minds that upon any probable appearances do despise danger, and bodies able to endure as much as the height of their own minds can undertake. There will be another helmsman and a second group of Argonaut heroes. Signed, Sir William Alexander
And so you can see how serious William Alexander took his adventure in Nova Scotia. And we've been using research that I did in my books and books that Doc Hamill's helped me with that are bringing out history that's been just lying there waiting for somebody to reveal it again and to piece it together. And so we want you to come back next month. We're going to speak specifically of the 90-foot stone said to be found in the Money Pit in 1804. So I'm so happy to have had Sir William Alexander here with me this month, and we'll see you next month. Thank you so much.
This is Robert Clotworthy, and you have been listening to Oak Island Plus, a discussion of Oak Island and other mysteries from around the world. Be sure to catch every episode.